It's Common Ground, the policy roundtable where we discuss issues in the news and try to hammer out our differences. As folks who are familiar with the show know, potentially more familiar than I apparently am, we ordinarily have a panel of Newton residents on the show, and we have people with different perspectives on various topics, and we go around the table, each panelist expressing a viewpoint. I then select the two panelists who disagree the most strongly and ask them to speak directly to one another in hopes of finding some area of agreement. I then put my 2 cents in on the topic and give an assessment of how we did at finding common ground. That is how the show usually works. But once in a while, once in a great while, over the course of the nearly 21 years we've been doing this show, we have some very special episodes in which we have somebody so interesting and compelling that I want the whole hour to talk to them. That's happened with Congressman Frank. It's happened with various candidates for mayor over the years. And spoiler alert, we have one such person here tonight. And due to the camera angle, you already know who it is if you recognize him. It's Marc Laredo.
Great
Welcome,
to see
Marc.
you, Ken. Thank you.
Marc has a outstanding resume, very impressive resume in the city of Newton government and also professionally. I'm going to touch the surface on this, but it would take most of our hour to go through all of Marc's accomplishments. But Marc is currently the president of the Newton City Council. I think it would be fair to say he used to be the former president of the city council because he was the council president before a period of time, not the council president. Marc, you were also the chair of the land use committee, a very important committee of the city council. And I believe there was a time in the before times when you were chair of the school committee.
That's right. I served in the school committee for 8 years, including my last year as chair.
So now, I know that there's been a few people in the history of the city of Newton who have served both as president of the then Board of Aldermen, now called City Council, and chair of the school committee. I know Vern Vance did that. I believe Susan Albright is another person in that category.
That's correct.
And is that it, or is there anyone else?
I think that may be it. There have been a number of people over the years who've served on the school committee and then the city council.
There have been people who've served in both, but to be the leader of both bodies, I think you're one of three people.
I think Councilor Albright is one, and Alderman Vance was the other.
Right. So that is a distinguishing characteristic in and of itself. That's a small elite group, but you're striving, I think, to be a groundbreaker, much like Otani with the 50-50 club, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, being the first to achieve the trifecta, as it were, of president of the city council / board of aldermen, chair of the school committee, and mayor of the city. Is there anyone else who's ever done that?
I don't think anyone else has taken on all three roles, and hopefully I'll be successful in achieving the third one and I can hit the trifecta.
Right. Well, I mean, there have been people, obviously presidents of the council are acting mayor, but that's not the same thing. Being the chief executive is. Anyway, so there's so much I want to ask you about, Marc, about why you're running, what you hope to accomplish, some of the issues I know that people in the city are concerned about. Before we dive into that, I think we'd be remiss today, it being January 9th, 2025, a federal holiday declared for the late, recently deceased President Jimmy Carter, if we didn't acknowledge him. And I can tell you, just personally, I mean, you and I are both old enough to remember the Carter administration. This is a guy who made human rights his priority. I mean, there are, to me, that in and of itself, putting aside, the Camp David Accords and his relative success or failure on inflation and economic issues and a lot of things he tried to do, and I can tell you all about the windfall profits tax that he didn't manage to get, because I wrote my undergraduate thesis comparing him to Johnson. But putting aside whether he was successful or not, I think he was, as president, he was tremendously admirable for his values and the things he tried to accomplish. And I hope that we can all hold him up as a role model for making an effort to make the world a better place, because his heart clearly was dedicated to making the world a better place.
You know, Ken, I think that's really right. And I think he led an admirable personal life. He had strong convictions. He acted on those convictions. He was highly ethical. And you judge anyone by how they interact when they're a small child, how they interact as an adult, and if they're president, what they do after they're president. And in all of those things, I think he led a tremendously impactful life, a life well lived.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I think almost inarguably the greatest post-presidency president in our history. From you know, obviously Nobel Peace Prize winning, but his efforts to broker peace, to build housing, to do just a wide range of admirable
eradicating diseases. I mean, he really was, I concur completely. Post-presidency, he didn't just step back and give a lot of speeches and sit on some corporate boards. He really made a difference, not only in the United States, but throughout the world.
Right. I mean, and you know, without disparaging any other former presidents, I would say that he set a bar that has yet to be matched.
Yeah, I think that will be very hard, in part because he has such a long, active life, and even how he chose to face death, I think, was truly inspiring.
Absolutely inspiring. Had a lot of accomplishments. Also had some things that he's well known for not accomplishing, but eventually got those hostages home. I was in elementary school, and I remember we were sitting at the edge of our desks, wondering when that was going to happen. But anyway, I hats off to Jimmy Carter, and a holiday well deserved in his honor.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of chief executives, in no particular order, Mark, I want to ask you about a bunch of issues. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you the zinger of a tough question. Why do you want to be mayor of Newton?
Well, it's both easy and complicated, Ken. Okay, it's easy because I absolutely love this city. This has been my home for most of my life. I've spent many years in public service here, and I think we have a great community. I really do. And we can do even better. And I am hopeful as mayor, with my leadership style and the way I'm going to approach the job, that I bring this community even more together, try to build consensus on tough issues, and really lead us forward in the next 4 years.
What is your leadership style, Mark?
3 things. Number 1, I am a huge believer in surrounding myself with strong people. And by that, I mean people who are not afraid to tell me if they think I'm making a mistake or I can do something better. Leaders should not necessarily think of themselves as the smartest person in the room. Rather, they should try to build a team in place that collectively can do far better. And so in my administration, I'm going to encourage that broad diversity of opinion. And we've been doing that in the campaign trail and as part of my campaign team, because that makes me a better candidate and it will make me a far better mayor. So that's bucket number 1. Bucket number 2 is I'm in a service business in my day job. I'm a lawyer like you.
And I should have mentioned that in the introduction. Many accomplishments. Laredo and Smith is your firm. How long have you had that firm?
We've been around now since 1996.
And you have experience running a business in that you were managing partner for that firm?
I've been managing partner for a significant amount of time. I actually stepped down January 1 this year as part of our firm transition plan, which by the way, is a healthy thing to do in businesses, and I think
also probably frees up a little time for the campaign trail.
Frees up a little more time, but the key there is I know what it's like to run a business, and my business is a service-oriented business, which means we work for our clients just like you do. City government is a service business. I'm going to have 90,000 bosses in this city, and everybody at City Hall always needs to be thinking with that mentality. Now, we have great city employees. I don't think people realize what a good staff we have at City Hall and in our school system. But that doesn't mean we can't do better. And that means if a resident calls with a problem or writes with a problem, whatever that is, we're there to help them solve the problem. And that's the mentality that needs to permeate every single thing we do. Third piece, I'm a huge believer that if you get 70% of what you want and you get 70% of the people behind you and you get it done pretty quickly, you've done a great job. And if you strive to get that last bit of what you want, but you get maybe a 51, 49% vote, or even worse, you lose, you failed. And you failed for several reasons. One, you truly may fail and get nothing done. Two, even if you get something done, it's usually taking you a lot more time to get there. Three, you leave a divided community. And so my leadership style is build consensus whenever possible. Try to get whatever your goal is there. And you can always add to it. You can always change it. You can always
Mark,
amend it.
so if you could change any one thing about the city of Newton, not its government, what would that be?
You know, Ken, I'm not sure I'd change any one thing, okay? I think there's areas in the city that are of particular priority to me that I'm going to focus on. To me, number one priority is education. We have a great superintendent. I think we had a very difficult time in our schools over the last several years. COVID was very hard on our kids, hard on our teachers too. We had a teacher strike that was very difficult. And leaving aside the reasons for it or how it was handled or any of those things, suffice to say that having teachers on strike for 2 weeks, kids out of the classroom, created a lot of dissatisfaction in the community. And so part of my job is to work with the superintendent, the school committee, and really continue to rebuild the trust in our educational system, because we do have a great educational system here, but we can be better.
So there's nothing in the city that you'd want to improve in terms of services? Nothing where you go, you know, we do a good job of this, we need to do a better job.
Look, if you want to talk about where we do a good job, we can do it better, roads and sidewalks are number one, okay? If you talk to the average resident, they say, look, I got a pothole on my street, it hasn't been fixed. So can we do better there? Absolutely. Should we do better there? Absolutely. Are we going to do better there? Absolutely.
Mark, what is the game plan for doing better? Is it more money? Is it a different management style? What will get us? Every mayor, of course, says, "Yeah, I'll do a better job with the potholes." Right? Why is Marc Laredo the guy who's going to fix the potholes?
It's a multifaceted thing. Okay, I'm not in the inner workings of our Department of Public Works. We have a new commissioner coming on, Shauna Sullivan, who I think is going to be great, and we had a very good previous commissioner, Jim McGonigal. But you want to step back. You always step back and say, how are we doing things? Are there ways we can deliver services better? That's number one. Number two, money talks, okay? That's an area we have to devote sufficient resources to. And that involves trade-offs, okay? And I'm not sure exactly where those trade-offs necessarily will be, but if you want something that affects virtually every resident in the city, it's streets and sidewalks. Another area I think we need to work on is we have a really good police and fire department. We just today celebrated the promotion of a new chief, George McMains, who's been promoted from within. We promoted several other officers, and these are really terrific folks, okay? We need to make sure we do two things. We need to make sure that we're recruiting sufficiently so we get our force back up to capacity. That's number one.
When you said police and fire department, both departments are understaffed?
Fire's not understaffed right now. We've done a pretty good job of maintaining it, but police are. And we're not alone in that. Policing is, by definition, in the last few years, has been a hard field to fill. And it's critically important that we not just fill positions, but we get the best candidates, because we want to use 21st century policing techniques.
Let me ask you a question about that. One of the hot button issues of the day is DEI. You say get the best qualified candidate. Do you think we should be focusing on affirmative action or trying to recruit people from underrepresented communities to be in our police and fire departments?
We absolutely should be having as broad a diversity within our city as possible, okay? And recruitment and actively going out and seeking people is a great way to do that. Why? Because you want a police force, you want a fire department, you want city workers who reflect a variety of different perspectives, different backgrounds. We function better when we have that diversity right within our ranks. So sure, I think it's very important to go out and you start by recruitment's critical. If you don't get people to apply for the jobs in the first place, you don't have a wide enough pool to choose from. And then we choose the best applicants. But we want to encourage people as much as possible to apply for the jobs in the first instance. Sure.
You know, we have a limited amount of time. I'm going to dive into a few of these. You mentioned schools as a top priority.
Absolutely.
I think for a lot of us, it's why my family moved to Newton, is the reputation of the schools. I think it's why a lot of the people in the community are here because of the great schools. But that having been said, there's some things that over time have been lousy about the Newton schools. We've had some infrastructure issues. You know, at one point there were kids being tutored in broom closets because we didn't have space. We've had leaky roofs and poor heating systems where the classrooms are freezing. We didn't have full kindergarten until after almost everyone else in the state. And recently there's been this issue of these classrooms where you have multiple classes being taught in the same classroom, where, in other words, you have an advanced biology class, an AP biology class, and a more basic there are various classes being taught, math classes, in the same classroom at the high school level. I'm curious, I know you're familiar with this issue because I know you've talked to people about it. What is your view on these multi-level classrooms?
Well, let me step back a little bit first because you asked a pretty long introduction to that question. So look, I think things like improving school buildings absolutely critical. I give Mayor Warren and Mayor Fuller considerable credit, and really in large part due to the outstanding work of Josh Morse, who's the Commissioner of Public Buildings, who does really an outstanding job. We've done a good job. We've built a whole, starting with Newton North High School, which was actually under Mayor Cohen, and I was instrumental in the school committee in helping get that project approved and built, and I stand by it. It is a great school. It's one of the decisions I'm really proud of. But the infrastructure piece, the school buildings piece, in some ways is easy. It's a matter of money. Obviously, you've got to devote sufficient resources to it, but it's not one of ideology or how you should teach. I think virtually everyone agrees that you want to have, and you need to have, not want, but need to have good school buildings in order to have good teaching. So your question is more curriculum related.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the mayor is not the superintendent, but mayors have a lot of influence in these things.
You know, it's interesting because I think sometimes folks forget that we have state laws that govern how schools are supposed to be run. The school committee has authority in actually very limited areas. It has authority over the hiring and firing of the superintendent. That's a critical job. And second, it is authority over the budget. It's given a monetary amount of budget from the money from the mayor, and then the school committee decides how that money is going to be spent. Very important decision. And it sets some very broad policies. Curriculum decisions, just like the one you're talking about, are really more in the hands of the superintendent and her assistant superintendents and other building leaders. So that's an example of a place where I would really defer, not completely, because there's always some guidance.
Do you have an opinion on it? Obviously, the mayor has a bully pulpit, though. Do you think? There have been advocates. There have been petitions. I know you've read these materials. I'm curious what your view on it is.
You know, my view is this. I've listened. I've read the materials, particularly from the Newton South teachers.
There was an op-ed. I mean, we had our whole last show on this here. And
I thought it was very thoughtful. It strikes me that they made a very good argument as to why, having some form of different levels can make a lot of sense. What I would want to know is what is the data showing? That to me is critical, because it's one thing for me to have a gut instinct. That's a very poor way of making any decision. So I want to see either with the concept of leveling or de-leveling, what does the data show in terms of outcomes for kids at different levels? And not only academic outcomes, but how they view school. Are they viewing it more positively or more negatively? Because that's also very
So
important.
you, in other words, at this point, you have not seen sufficient data to render a judgment about that.
I'm going to be very cautious since I'm not a member of the school committee and haven't had.
Well, but you're running to be an ex officio member of the school committee.
And when I'm a member of the school committee and when I have the opportunity as a school committee member to have the administrators sit down and talk to me directly, then I'll be more confident giving a firm, clear opinion as to which way we go. But until then, it's like I tell people on the campaign trail all the time, I'm not going to make a lot of promises. I think that's a mistake. I think it's critical to explain to people how you make decisions. And part of my decision-making process is to gather information, gather data, and then make what I call data-driven decisions.
Well, thanks, Mark. One of the data-driven decisions you've made recently is on Birdo. This is the building code requirement that has both a reporting and eventually a little bit of a binding requirement on the amount of energy that buildings are going to use. Basically, so Birdo applies to existing buildings, not just to new buildings, which all have to be electrified under a confusingly similar and yet distinct city ordinance, the electrification ordinance. So the big, I guess, controversy about Birdo was whether to include residential or not. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how you came to the decision you came to, what data you looked at, because the city council eventually voted to exclude residential. To be clear, it applies only to large buildings at first. I'm interested in, I think our viewers would be interested in hearing your thought process, how you absorbed that information and made your decision.
You know, I think how and it wasn't my decision, it was a vote of the city council to be
I should be clear, your decision on how you would cast your individual vote.
First of all, I think how the Zoning and Planning Committee went about its work in looking at Birdo, thinking about the issue of residential, thinking, by the way, about whether Newton Wellesley also was included in the Birdo requirements or not, was exactly the type of thoughtful analysis I think we need to do in city government. Why? Because they understood there's a real problem, okay? Climate change is a real problem, and we all, nationally, internationally, at the state level, and at the local level, have obligations to try to tackle that problem. So it's critical that we do so. You also have to understand, whenever you do something, there's cost involved. And you've got to look at costs, because the costs are borne often by either, really in the case of residential properties, they're borne by residents. If you're requiring your your residential landlords to spend more money on something, they pass it on in increased rents. If you're requiring individuals who own a single family or two family or three family house, that's an additional cost. We already have very high housing costs here, and so you need to factor that in. So
that was the driving factor in your decision?
I think that was a very significant factor in my decision, that it was a balancing act.
And you voted with a majority to exclude the...
I did, and I did so in part because I respected greatly the work that was done at the committee level by my colleagues who really, I'm not on the Zoning and Planning Committee, but they really, under the leadership of Chair Lyle Baker and Vice Chair John Oliver, the committee as a whole really examined the issues carefully. They had tremendous support from the city's sustainability staff, from other folks in Green Newton and other advocacy groups, which provided very valuable input. But, you know, here's the beauty of this. You enact Birdo for the commercial buildings. You see how it plays out. You see what goes well.
That was my next question.
You see what goes poorly, and you can expand it. And that's what I talked about earlier on this evening, about the idea of getting 70% and 70% support. In fact, the Birdo passed almost unanimously by the city council.
Was there a dissenting vote?
There may, if there was, it may have been one or two.
I
but
thought it was unanimous.
it probably was. You know, I think it was unanimous. But regardless,
You were there. I wasn't.
I don't recall every single vote.
I only remember it because I know there's usually dissent in the city council, and I was impressed
not
that it
when
was.
not when we've reached consensus and we've reached compromise.
right.
And so that's a good example of how that.
Well, let me raise a slightly tougher issue to raise consensus on, and see what your thought process on this. Because I mean, I'm going to frame it how I see it,
Sure.
and you can tell me if my framing's dead wrong. Okay, fair enough.
You can frame it any way you want.
I'm going to frame it, though. I mean, after 18 years on the city council and as an observer of our city government for, oh gosh, getting real close to half a century now. That's not fair. For getting close to 40 years.
Fair enough.
I will tell you this. It seems to me that our city's finances boil down to a basic choice. We can either costs have gone up over the history faster than the rate of inflation. So fundamentally, assuming we don't want to cut services every year, we either periodically need to override Prop 2.5, which says that taxes can only go up at 2.5% plus new growth, or we need massive ratable new growth. And by ratable, I mean commercial new growth that doesn't add costs like kids to classrooms. So what that would mean would be increasing our commercial to residential ratio. Over the course of my time on the city council and since, the city's gone in the opposite direction. We were about 80% residential, 20% commercial, and our tax base when I was first elected in 91, I think we're closer to 90 to 10 now, residential to commercial.
We're not up to 90 to 10. I think it's probably around.
It's like 88, I think.
I think it may be at 84, 85.
Okay.
But the point is well taken. We have lost some.
Let me get to the
commercial
question.
base.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
I'm sorry to.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. There has been, with the MBTA Communities Act and other, there's been a lot of push to say we need more housing. And so my question to you is real simple. It's actually two simple questions. Which approach to balancing the budget do you prefer? The tax increase or commercial growth? And we'll start with that, and then.
You probably.
And if you think that's an unfair way to frame it, tell me.
I don't think they're either or, but I think you may have to do some of both. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the override piece first, okay? Mm-hmm. As you know, but our viewers may not, there's two types of overrides. One is a debt exclusion override where you say...
That technically, Mark, not an override of debt exclusion because it doesn't add to the base. It's just for an individual project.
But it adds to the individual's taxes.
Only until the debt is paid.
But the debt may be paid over a 5, 10, 20-year period, so it's a long time.
Oh, absolutely, okay. But then when it's over, the base goes back down.
Except then you'll do the next project after that, and you'll probably have another override for that. So,
just to be clear, though, a debt exclusion is not an override. People get this wrong all the time.
You know, you and I can quibble about the wording. To me, it means that somebody for the period of time is going to pay more taxes to fund some government service. So
right. But it doesn't, but as you said before, we're in the service business, right?
It's not permanent.
In most of our budget, I mean, just to talk to the reality here, most of the budget is salaries. And salaries don't go back down once the building's built.
All right, but let's talk about that for a second. Mayors have a lot of discretion as to whether they try to pay for buildings within funds available from their operating budget and they just add to the city debt, or on occasion, like we've done with a number of our school buildings and our fire stations, they ask the voters to approve additional spending for a particular project. What I've called the debt exclusion override, you've termed it a little differently, same concept. So, those are easier to pass.
Great, but Mark, what I'm asking you about is overrides versus not debt exclusions. I'm asking a narrower question. Using a debt exclusion to fund a capital project as opposed to using cash doesn't get to the overall conundrum at the heart of the
It actually does in a way, Ken. Okay, because if you're using a debt exclusion override to pay for the construction of a school building, and you're not taking those funds out of your operating budget and using it to fund debt, you have more money in your operating budget. okay? You've taken the cost of building a brand new school and you've essentially found a separate funding source for it, the debt exclusion money. But that's not the whole problem, and I know that's not what you're getting at completely. You're talking about the operating overrides.
What I'm getting at, and I'm sorry if I haven't articulated this clearly, is you've got two slanted lines.
They're
right?
not. They're not. You're trying to say it's an either/or proposition.
I'm not.
And I'm not. And I'm suggesting you it's not an either/or. You actually have to think about both.
What I'm asking you, and let me try to articulate it better, I'm sorry, is my obviously opinion, but I think the numbers back it up, is that costs, energy costs, cost of construction, cost of a jug of milk, right? Costs that, and therefore salaries to pay employees who have to buy a jug of milk have gone up at a greater rate than 2.5% plus per year. So even if you take the buildings out of the equation entirely, without periodically overriding Prop 2.5, you need some. And sorry if I phrased it as an either or, but I'm interested in insight into Marc Laredo's brain as to how you grapple with an inherently tremendously unpopular thing, raising people's taxes, as compared, and how you make that decision as compared to adding commercial to development to the city.
As I said, I think you probably at times have to do both. Okay, let's talk about the override first, and then we can talk about commercial development second. As I said, they're not mutually exclusive. So,
and I'm sorry if I implied
no,
that.
No. Override. To me, there's three basic factors, okay? One, you've got to explain to the voters, not that you're just going to keep the status quo, but with some additional money. These are real improvements you're going to see in the city. Those real improvements might be...
Fixing those potholes?
Yeah. Fixing those potholes could be a very good one. We are going to, if you go out and say, we are going to improve the rate of fixing our streets by X%, that's what we're promising you. We're going to do better than we've done. That's something that's an improvement, okay? An improvement might be we're going to do certain things differently in the schools. We need more money to do X, Y, or Z, whatever those are. So that's number one. You've got to have a clearly articulable goal. Number two, you got to take the temperature of where you are fiscally on the local level and where you are on a state and national level. So if we're in the middle of a recession, if we have double-digit inflation, and if the city or if the city's sitting on $40 or $50 million of free cash, that's a very, very hard sell. Because the average person says either I'm suffering because of inflation, I'm suffering because of a recession, or the city has a lot of money. I don't care if you call it one-time money or not, it's sitting on a pile of money. So that's a very hard sell. But you got to time it right. And there's no magic to that. You got to really look where you are in a variety of ways. Third factor, the voters really are trusting the mayor to deliver. And that means the mayor has done a sufficient job in terms of how he or she is managing the budget, managing finances, and the voters say, I trust this mayor to deliver on the promise. So if I essentially give this mayor more money, and the mayor wants to do certain improvements, those improvements are going to be carried out. If any one of those three things fail, you're going to have an extraordinarily difficult time passing an override. So the voters may trust you completely. You might have very good use of money, but if you've got double-digit inflation or you're in a recession or people are feeling really anxious because there's a war somewhere, you're not going to pass an override.
Isn't there always a war somewhere, Mark?
Hopefully not someday, but there always is. But let us say a war that affects you economically.
Okay. Let me reframe the commercial development side of it.
Sure.
Because I think there has been, I mean, you look at other cities and towns in the area, and there have been various approaches. I think we can learn a lot from other communities. There have been various approaches to commercial development, and some of our surrounding cities and towns have a much higher commercial to residential tax base than us. Cambridge, for example, Boston, there are a number of Waltham, a number of communities have a much higher percentage of their tax revenue that's generated by commercial. And so you corrected me earlier about the percentages. You said it's 84% residential.
Somewhere around there. We're quibbling about the percentage because it's really not the issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess ultimately, and I may be misremembering what it was in 1991, please don't hold me to that figure, but I'm interested to know which direction you want to move the needle. I mean, do you want to move it towards a higher percentage of commercial, which would mean, of course, that with all the new residential building we're doing, we would need some fairly intense new commercial development? Or are you comfortable with it shifting more in the direction of a higher percentage of residential?
I'm not comfortable with a shift more towards the residential in terms of percentage, because that has actually some very profound negative implications for us financially. As you said earlier, you can argue whether or not residential is a net positive for your tax base or not. I think most of the studies I've seen say it is not a net. You're not going to increase your revenue more than you increase the cost of doing services.
And by a very significant factor.
But commercial is clearly more favorable because you tax it at a much higher rate, and by definition, commercial requires very few city services. So it is.
And services, the services that commercial requires, you're doing anyway. Like
exactly,
they require streets. And
they're not. It's not primarily education.
It's not senior centers and schools.
It's not senior centers, education, things like that. So here's a challenge that we face in Newton, not unlike people facing, all over, but especially in communities like Newton, which are really knowledge-based communities in many ways. We don't farm here, for example. The need for office space has changed dramatically since the pandemic. If you look anywhere, downtown Boston, you look at major cities, we are not going to have the same paradigm of people working in their offices all the time that we did 10 or 15 years ago. I look at that through how I work, although I go to my office.
So do you think we should tax people's houses where people are working from home as commercial then?
Absolutely.
Because that's what...
No, well, I'm not advocating for that at all. Okay, let's take that off the table.
Well, then how do we address this problem of disappearing commercial tax base?
Two things. Okay, we've got to go out and do a far better job, frankly, in city government of going out and talking to the local businesses that are in our village centers and finding out what do they need to be successful. And by local businesses, I'm talking primarily the retail, the restaurants, other what I'd call the classic storefront service businesses. What do they need to be successful? Is it wider sidewalks? Is it better lighting? Is it more benches in front of their establishments? There may be an array of things that we can do as a city.
You're talking about retail establishments?
Absolutely. Okay.
Not offices.
Let me distinguish between the two, because I think they're different. And I think each village is different. The needs of Nenantum, for example, might be very different than the needs of Waban, which is, as you know, a much smaller commercial center. Different than Newton Highlands, for example, which is a fair amount larger, but not, say, as large as Nenantum is, which frankly is a very successful retail area. Lots of shops, lots of people going in and out, lots of restaurants, a lot of locally owned businesses, exactly what we want to encourage. So that's one piece of it. What does each village need? And do a somewhat, go out and start by talking to people, finding out what they're saying on the grounds, talking to the owners of these businesses, asking what they need from the city. How can the city help them? That's piece number one. Piece number two is probably more complicated. And frankly, I think we're going to have to bring people together from the business community to think about it. How do we replace some of the space that was formerly office space, and what other types of commercial spaces do we put there? Do we have co-working spaces, for example? Do we do more to go out to other parts of the Commonwealth, other states, even other countries, and say, hey, Newton is a destination? And couple that with how do we promote the arts within all of that, because that in turn helps the vibrancy of our village centers, and also can be a way that we promote, the traditional office type space. So we're going to have to think creatively about how we reuse that.
Thanks, Mark. Let me offer you a hypothesis.
Sure.
And let you react to it as a thought experiment here. Here's the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that Newton's development has been reactive, and that what we have in Newton isn't it isn't that our office space is going unrented because people don't need office space. It's that we have low quality office space and we don't have a critical mass of it and we don't have proactive planning. And that there are many lawyers, like me, for example, who've gone, oh, is there some good Class A office space in Newton close to home? And have found, no, there isn't. And there isn't a building with a critical mass of office space. And if we had a mayor who had the leadership skills to bring people together and say, hey, look, if we can make we can do something that's great for the environment, which is all these lawyers are now living in Newton and going downtown, but we're going to create a Class A quality office space district for professionals, that even people maybe who work in the office 2-3 days a week. We're going to build this new office space. Here's where we're going to do it in Newton. We're going to create this district. My hypothesis is, that I'd like you to react to, that that mayor could, for the long term, solve the city's financial problems.
I think it's a little bit too easy, Ken. First of all, we don't live in a blank slate in the city of Newton. So we don't have a whole bunch of former farmland that we can annex and build our office complex in that you're talking about. It doesn't exist in the city anymore. We do have spaces within the city that might be suitable for some of that type of development. I think that type of development and thinking is good. But the city's not going to build it itself. It requires private sector to do that. Right now, for better or worse, what we're hearing from the private sector is they don't want to build that type of space because they can't make money at it. So, for example, we approved 2 projects in this city. Riverside, which I have now voted on 3 separate times, all in favor of it, to build various versions of the Riverside project. The developer's now saying, I'm not building commercial space, I'm not building lab space, there's not going to be a hotel there, it's going to be all residential.
Has that been going on for like 25 years? It seems like it's been going on
I don't know
forever.
Whenever you talk about housing and zoning, you start with, okay, here are the zoning rules, but then you have to get someone in to actually build it. And right now in the construction industry, if you follow what's going on, it's become very expensive for contractors to actually build. And we have a number of projects in the city that we have approved. We have approved these projects. We want these projects to get built. And for whatever reasons, they haven't been. That's very problematic too.
I'm gonna ask you some hopefully quick takes.
Sure.
Are we adequately funding OPEB, other post-employment benefits? In other words, we owe more money for employees' post-retirement benefits than we have funded. That we've been audited, and we're way out into the future on this. Mayor Fuller created an account in her first term and started putting some money into it. Are we adequately funding that?
We're clearly not adequately funding it, but I think under Mayor Warren and Mayor Fuller, they've developed reasonable plans to fund first our pension obligations, which must be fully funded by 2040.
They just pushed it back, right? It was, yeah.
And then
the legislature pushed it.
OPEB thereafter, and take monies that you're putting in the budget. Here's a tension right now that and this is going to be a real tension for the next mayor. Right now, the retirement board says, even though the deadline is 2040, that we have to fully fund by either 2032 or 2033. Don't hold me to which one, which means that every year we're increasing the portion of the budget devoted to pensions by 6+%. Now, people might say 6%, what's the big deal? Well, when you were putting $1 million in to your pension obligation, 6% is not a big deal. When you're putting in $10 million or $15 million a year, whatever our current number is, that 6% starts to get much bigger. And that 6% is a much higher rate of growth than the rest of the
Than
city.
our revenue.
So it's exactly right. So one thing I'm going to be
So
looking
it's cutting
at,
into something else.
one thing I'm going to be looking at very carefully is, and I've talked to municipal finance experts about this, is are there ways we can smooth that out over a period of 5, 6, 7 years, meet our obligations, because it's critical that we fulfill our obligations to our retirees to fully fund our pension, and then when that is done, move over to the OPEB obligation. We need to do both. But there are budgetary ways to do that smooth it out, that create less of a stress on the budget, especially in about 3 or 4 years.
All right. We have a strong mayor form of government. You've been on the legislative side of the legislative executive disputes, to the extent there have been disputes, or balance of power. Just quick take on what's your view on is our mayor too strong, not strong enough, just about right? How do you feel about that?
You know, Ken, you were an alderman, right?
For 18 years.
18 years. I think on any given day, all 24 city councilors think in some way or another they can do a better job than the mayor. And that's just a given. That's just the way.
But I'm talking about the structural democratic element.
No, I understand the structure issue. Look, we have a strong mayoral form of government. It's good and bad, okay? It is good because it allows executive decision making. It's not so good because it leaves the legislative body relatively weak. And except for decisions about land use and zoning, the mayor has almost complete control.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the city council should have more of a voice in budget decisions? Would you involve the city council more in budget planning?
There's a difference there.
Well, yes or no to either one of them, or both of them.
One is a change in the charter, which is a very difficult thing to do, and you got to think a long term.
Well, Ted Mann, just by way of example, used to bring in the whole city council, talk about what the trade-offs were, and get input before writing his budget book. That's what I'm doing. And basically said, I'm willing, if you have something you want funded, show me where to get the money, and I'm happy to fund it, and was very interactive. Other mayors more recently, without naming names, my impression has been, in my experience with some also on the council, were less interested in input from the Board of Aldermen. And I'm curious, what kind are you going to be?
You know, early on, I spoke about the importance of having people on your team who are comfortable disagreeing with you, who are strong. That means you bring your city councilors in the room early and often, and you involve them in the thought process. And that's very healthy. Why? You get wisdom by getting other intelligent people being involved in the process. And hopefully you build more consensus because people feel like they're part of the process, genuinely part of the process. Their voice is heard. They're more likely to feel supportive of the end result. So that's a win. And to me, that's not very hard. It's just how I'm going to operate. You bring people in. You bring everybody in, not just a select few. You bring everybody in. Now, obviously, if you have committee chairs or a president, they're going to be a more direct, regular contacts. That's just how you have to function. But the idea of incorporating that, I think, is great. And I will do that because I think it's the right thing to do.
Thanks, Mark. One of the questions that we're confronted with is we're told there's a housing crisis. Some would argue it's an affordable housing crisis and rich people have no problem finding a home. But putting that aside, there's a push on and there's laws, including the MBTA Communities Act and local ordinances, to build more housing. Right now, our population's about 90,000 people, as you cited earlier, 90,000 bosses, as you said. There is a trade-off. As you have more people, you get more traffic, you need more classrooms, more infrastructure, more water pressure, all the other expenses. And at a certain point, you have a different feel to the community if it becomes dense beyond a certain point. My question is really simple. The land area of the city of Newton's not likely to change. So what would you say is the ideal population? At what point would you say, we've got 90,000, should Newton have 100,000 people, 150,000 people? What would feel right to you, Mark?
I don't have a firm answer to that, Ken, and I don't know where we're going to be in 50 or 100 years. There's so many different factors that come into play. Here's things that you got to think about now, okay? You're going to make darn sure that you're preserving your open spaces, your parks, your recreational facilities, because whether you have a population of 90,000 people or 110,000 people, you've got to have those places in the city for people. They're critically important. Number two, you've got to think when you're creating development rules, what kind of green space you're going to have, even on individual properties. So are you going to require setbacks? Are you going to have tree requirements? Are you going to have other things that play a critically important role in climate? And also create a sense of, a sense of livability, okay? I don't think anybody moved to Newton so they could feel like they're living in the heart of Manhattan. It's just not what people bought.
So there is a limit, you just don't.
It's not a numerical limit necessarily, okay? You could have a variety of different types of developments. I mean, you might have a riverside where you're going to have 500 units.
Well, I mean, I guess we could put it this way.
Okay.
Clearly, the city of Boston is more densely populated than the city of Newton, right?
In most parts of the city, it is.
Overall, okay, so
Although there's parts of the city of Boston that are as suburban as parts of Newton.
here's something that people said to me over the course of my years in elected office is I moved to Newton because I like Newton. If I wanted to live in Cambridge or Somerville or Boston, I would have moved to those. I'm sure you've heard things like that. And I'm just giving you a chance to react to the sentiment that there is a limit to what we want in terms of density.
We are never going to be, you're never going to be static as a city, okay? Being static and not having any development is actually very unhealthy, okay? It drives people and businesses away, and you start to see in larger cities when you get that, you actually get a sense of collapse. Not that we're going to face that here in Newton. What we need to do, though, and we need to be honest about it, is if we're going to increase, if we're starting to see development increasing somewhere to 15 or 20% increase in our population, for example, we got to make darn sure that the city services can keep up with it. And I am very suspect of studies, particularly about school population, that say, don't worry about it, it's going to decline. It's never going to increase again. I don't buy that because I don't find that particularly logical. I was in a school committee and I've been in city government, whereas except for the last few years, we had a very steady, significant rise in population over time, number one. Number two, if building apartments and other smaller units achieves its desired effect, one of the effects that we talk about wanting is getting folks who may be 70 or 75 or 80 out of their larger homes where they're not sending kids to school into an apartment or a condominium. So even if that group of people is not adding to the school population, the people moving into their home are. So you're going to have pressures on both places. So I think we got to plan appropriately, and that's very important.
Thank you, Mark. There are a few more things I want to ask you.
Sure.
I know that we had, I hear from the control room, a couple minutes of technical difficulty. So I'm going to ask, can you stay like 2-3 minutes?
I'll stay as long as you want, Ken.
We'll throw the whole thing up on the web. If we get cut off at 8:30 because we're the live show, the rest will be on the web and we'll edit it all to fit in.
Just cut off all my bad comments.
There were none of those, Mark. Nothing to cut out. We'll cut out my dumb questions. Anyway, there's been some discussion about whether Newton, right now we have a law that says you can't park overnight or continuously overnight on the streets. And there's going to be a question on the ballot about that. There have been votes by the city council on it. And the idea is to say, the advocates say, hey, this is kind of anachronistic. For one thing, with global warming, we don't have a lot of overnight snow events that we need to plow overnight. But beyond that, we can send people a text message and say, get your car off the street. We don't, on 70-degree days, need to have a winter parking ban. Other people say, hey, we want to discourage too many cars. It can lead to more density if people have places to park, and it'll park up our streets. And there have been various arguments on that side of it. My question is simple. Where do you come down on repealing the overnight parking?
So my feeling on that one is it's going to be on the ballot, and I'm going to abide by the wishes of the voters.
Okay.
And
you're not going to take a position on it before?
I'm not taking a public position on it because it's before the voters. Let the voters decide. And that's a classic ballot position.
But let me ask you a question, Mark. I mean, come on. You and I both know there have been things on the ballot, and you've campaigned on one side. If there were something to repeal Roe versus Wade protections, you'd have a position on it.
This is one.
You're a voter. Don't you have a view on it?
You know, I'm going to go to the ballot box and vote my way. I'll say this, okay? I think that the overnight parking ban has served some very useful purposes in multiple different ways. Number one, we have short memories at times. And if you look back, I think it was 2015, the winter where we had, 100 inches of snow over the course of the winter, most of that in February and March. And we had several months of streets that were pretty difficult to get through. You'd go to other cities and towns, by the way. It was much easier to navigate. Go into a city like Boston where they have, street parking 24/7, and those streets become virtually unpassable. So that's issue number one. Second, in certain parts of the city, Nanantum's a very good example, parts of my ward, Ward 7, parts of Ward 4, you get a lot of issues with students parking their cars for 2-3 weeks at a time in residential zones. They don't want to pay for parking, and you are engaging in a behavior that you actually want to discourage. You're encouraging students to bring their cars to campus because they know they could park on a Newton Street free all year round. Third thing, a lot of our newer developments, Trio is a good example, but others as well. One of the selling points is far fewer spaces for cars and a decoupling of rent from charging for cars. So if you want to have a car, you now have to pay for it. Well, a lot of these big developments, Trio is a good example, are right in residential neighborhoods. So are all the folks in Trio?
Trio is Newtonville, the one on the corner of Walnut and Washington.
Voted for that project with a reduced number of parking spaces, but now you're sending exactly the wrong signal if you're trying to discourage, if you're an environmental person, you're trying to discourage car use. And then you say, sure, just bring your car, but you can park for free around the block. You've discouraged everything you're trying to encourage. So the third piece is, I think most people know that when they buy or rent a particular unit, they know what they're getting. Okay, so all those factors, I think, and the overnight parking ban may discourage people from getting that fourth or fifth family car. The flip side of it is, and it's a very legitimate concern, is there are some people who did not know about the limit on parking, may have had one car when they moved in, but their family has grown, may have teenagers or young adults who are living at home who need a car, and they simply don't have spaces to park. So those are the tensions that go into those kinds of issues. Not an easy one. And that's why it's on the ballot, and the voters will decide, and as mayor, I'll live with whatever the voters' decision is.
All right. One of the things we value in Newton is that we've got some great historic sites and properties. There's a wide range of things. We've got, of course, the Durant Kendrick House. Sure. We've got the Jackson Homestead, and that's sort of the museum end of the spectrum. Then we've got like landmark buildings and whatnot. And there are lots of things that get preserved in our site, like the Citgo sign in Boston. So one of the things that a lot of us thought was iconic was the old South Pacific sign, which got taken down. So my question to you, Mark, you've been a resident in the city a long time, is what's one thing in the city that if you could say we're going to preserve that's a part of what makes Newton Newton, you want to make it a landmark, keep it there for future generations, what would you pick as something you'd preserve?
I'm not going to landmark a single thing in the city like that, at least based on my personal opinion.
Forget about the legal landmarking.
I got to tell you,
what do you want to preserve?
I love Cabot's ice cream, and I love the Cabot sign, and if the Cabot sign was there for the next 50 years, that would be a wonderful thing, because it's exactly the type of, although they've just sold recently. It's exactly the type of family business that families go to generation after generation. That's iconic, that's local, that's a wonderful partner in the community. They give back tremendously. If we had 150 businesses like that in the city, and we do have a lot of businesses, by the way, that really do give back and really are part of the community, that makes the fabric of a community. That's what people love about a place to live.
Thank you, Mark. Let me give you an opportunity now to look at the camera and tell the people of Newton that if they elect Marc Laredo as Newton, one thing that'll be better about their life in the city of Newton, something that'll be better than it is today at some point after Marc Laredo is mayor of Newton.
I hope there's more than one thing.
You can pick. Well, you can. Go ahead, Nate. Go 2,
so
3.
Look, I hope that when I finish my tenure in office, you say the following about me, and you say the following about your lives. The guy worked hard. He worked really hard. He acted with integrity in every single thing he did. He listened carefully, genuinely listened, tried to incorporate people's opinions as best he could, built consensus as much as possible. And my schools are in a better place. My roads and sidewalks are in a better place. My public safety is in a better place. And this remains a wonderful community, a great place to live, great place to grow up in, great place to run a business in, a great place to come back to if you're lucky enough to move back here as I was and you were as adults. That's the kind of community I want.
I rushed right back after.
There's tremendous pride in living in what I think is a wonderful city. And if we all feel whenever my time in office ends, that this is a wonderful city to live, that we're proud of this city, I'll have done a great job.
Mark, thank you so much
Thank you so
for your
much.
time. Hour goes by real fast, doesn't it?
Thank you so much, Ken.
And thank you for putting your hat in the ring, putting your name out there. I know what it's like to run for office, so that's a huge, admirable step. And the slings and arrows that one encounters as a candidate are hopefully you've done it before. And
slings and arrows are part of the job. You develop.
Right. Well, you're a lawyer, so you know.
Develop a thick skin is perfectly fine. And a lot of it's because people are passionate. And if they're passionate about the city and passionate about improving the city, that's great.
It is a great community, and I can say, full disclosure, I'm an enthusiastic Marc Laredo for mayor supporter, and will be delighted if and when you're elected. I fully expect it to happen because I think Newton residents are very, very smart and will therefore be likely to vote for you.
Well, I think they're smart too, and I'll ask, as you always should ask. I'm really going to ask every single resident for their vote because I really
and presumably. There's, what is it, marclaredo.com?
It's www.laredofornewton.com.
LaredoForNewton.com.
Check out the website. You can read all about me, my background, my experience, my vision, where I stand on the issues.
Great, and people can reach you through it if they have questions.
Always happy to talk in person, by phone. Email.
Are you doing a lot of coffees?
I am doing a lot of coffees. I've done several already. I've got them scheduled all through the spring. I plan on trying to go door to door as much as possible, probably starting in April when it gets warm enough that people actually want to open their doors for you. But, you know, and I go to lots and lots of public events because talking to people, not talking to people, listening to people is critical. And that's what good leaders do.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for all your work on the City Council and School Committee before that. And thank you to our fabulous crew, to Will Carlyle, who's our director tonight, to John Fremer, to everyone here at New TV, and to you at home for watching. Please join us again next time when we try to find just a teensy-weensy bit more common ground.